Thank you very much. Well, some interesting things for us to reflect on. Owen, you've written recently about the potential role for networks in addressing the sort of bureaucratisation of aid. There are also some issues I'm sure you'll want to react to that Nairi and Leo have raised, but over to you.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me clearly?
We can raise the volume, so yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So let me say first, it's a really terrifically interesting book. So if Nairi only has 10 copies, I recommend that everybody in the room gets in the queue quickly to get a copy. Networks are, by their very nature, under-documented, under-researched, and having insights into how these networks actually operate in practice is a really interesting and I think potentially very important body of work. So congratulations for doing this, and also for talking about networks in a formal sense. When I sent round the paper that I recently wrote that talked about markets, networks and planning, a couple of people wrote back and said, I understand what planning is and I understand what markets are, but I don't really understand what you mean by these networks. And so it's useful to have this kind of more formal documentation about what it means and why they're important and how they're important. And of course you focused on a particular kind of network, networks of government officials involved in international finance. Perhaps not, there's a burgeoning literature about the role of networks, for example, in social production, in Wikipedia and open source operating systems, and there's a whole literature about what makes that work and what doesn't make that work. And I think what's interesting I found about your book was where the similarities are with some of those other kinds of networks and where the differences are. And what you've got here is very much a special case of networks. So you've got some of the characteristics of having no leader, having no formal hierarchy and structure, of having low costs of exit, of having norms and standards for how the network operates, and having a sense of it being non-hierarchical, of it challenging power relationships, which I think is really important. I think there's an interesting question then that you raise in the book about, well, how far do developing countries benefit from the challenging of power relationships implicit in the network model? For me, that was the interesting question. Do developing countries actually benefit from having a non-hierarchical, different power structure that a network implies compared to an institution? And my reading of not just on the G20 chapter, but on all that, I mean, you described it very eloquently yourself on the G20. The answer is no, developing countries are not benefiting enormously from the network structure in the G20 because they're not participating in it. But what struck me about the whole book was that the networks don't work very well in many respects. They seem to work well at setting agendas, perhaps a consensus building, and the policy coordination objective that you describe. But they don't seem to work all that well in the knowledge sharing and production, at least not the mixed networks, nor in the norm setting and diffusion role that you describe. And then there are lots of other things that you want to do in international relations that networks don't even try to do. Things like enforcing rules, settling disputes where there's a zero-sum game, so reconciling power conflicts where you don't have an instinct for collaboration, but where you have real conflict. Networks don't even seem to get off the ground at doing that kind of thing. They are much better where there is genuinely a community of interest that people can work together on. And so, I hear that Miles is sitting in the audience, and his chapter about the Commission for Africa explains from an insider's perspective what they thought they were doing in the Commission for Africa report and setting an agenda, and I think it did that very successfully. But then Nicholas Bain's rejoinder in the book says, well, it didn't really make any difference, because in the end, having individuals come together and reach agreements and have that trust and shedding the bureaucracy and finding each other doesn't change the world if the world is characterized by national interests, institutional interests, organizational and economic interests. There are no great men in history that can change that. So I was left feeling that the outsider perspective of the networks, that they don't really change very much, felt to me more compelling than the insider perspective, that on these terrific ways of doing business internationally, it didn't seem to me that from a developing country perspective they did really change the world. But I'm interested to know whether Miles feels that Nick Bain's attack or dissent is well placed or not. So let me give you 4 conclusions that I came to from the book. I think a lot of international institutions and bureaucracies tend to what is usually called the lowest common denominator. Actually, apart from being a cliche, I actually think it's the wrong mathematical metaphor. It's really the highest common factor that they reach. But this idea that if you have formal institutions, everybody goes with a veto, and you end up not being able to move the group forward. And I had the sense from the book that networks are good at avoiding that. By getting a group of people together who can build trust and a shared understanding, they can set aspirations that exceed the highest common factor or the lowest common denominator. But a lot of people, the second conclusion I reached was that a lot of people engage in networks because bureaucracies have failed in that respect of being able to set that common agenda. But bureaucracies exist for a reason, right? And they haven't just come about. Networks don't do very well at resolving. Let me just switch my phone on. Networks don't do very well at resolving disagreements, sorting out zero-sum games, and they don't have any mechanism to deliver. They have no way of actually, we saw this time and time again with G8 agreements, where the leaders would go off and agree to do things with neither any real clue what they were agreeing, nor any way of making it happen. And the result was that a lot of the things that they've agreed don't happen, or don't happen very well, or weren't necessarily a very good idea in the first place. So the lack of a bureaucracy is a benefit in some sense, but it's also a huge disadvantage. The third conclusion I reached was, Ken Livingstone had a book a few years ago called If Voting Changed Anything, They Would Abolish It. And the title was much better than the book. But I thought it was about networks. That if they changed anything, they would abolish them. The reason why it's okay to have developing countries sitting at the table participating in the networks is because the powerful know that in the end it's just a talk shop, it's just an agenda setting thing. They won't spend any money, they won't make any actual decisions that anybody has to carry out, and that's why developing countries are allowed to participate in them. So it seemed to me that they don't really give power to developing countries because they don't really exercise very much power, these networks. And then the fourth conclusion I reached is that bureaucracies ought to be thinking really hard about why these networks are seen by policymakers as so important. Why do policymakers so like shaking off their departmental brief? Why do they like being in a room and being confidential and being able to reach this? Why can't we simulate that in a bureaucratic environment? Why can't bureaucracies capture the best of what makes networks good and still deliver the best of what makes bureaucracies necessary? Why does it have to be an either-or? How can we link these things together better so that we have both agenda setting that captures more than the lowest common denominator and an actual delivery mechanism to make those things function on the ground? So those are my eyes. And just finally to say, I thought it was a really interesting read, a really interesting book, and I hope that we learn lots of lessons, particularly for how to address the power relationships in global governance.
Brilliant. Owen, thank you very much indeed for that. I really